I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. Hi, everybody. Spring is here. The weather has changed. There's more sun right now. The flowers are growing. They're everywhere. You have birds and bees flying all over the place. There's pollen over every square inch of your car. Basically, nature is having some serious raw sex as of right now. And lots of people, of course, enjoy this time of the year. It is the vernal equinox. We're just a little bit past that, which is when everything is equal. There is the same amount of daylight as there is darkness. And you get the feeling of rebirth. You know, the flowers and the leaves and all the animals that are out that you haven't seen before for quite a bit of time, that is. And they are all back. We have this feeling of renewal. And you can also call that resurrection. I bring that up because we just had Easter, one of the high holidays of Christianity, specifically in Catholicism. Easter is known as a movable feast. And what that means is that there's no one set calendar date for the holiday like you have for Christmas. Christmas is always December 25th. That has its own past. But what we have here for the movable feast of Easter, it happens the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox. What does any of this have to do with Jesus, right? Well, not that much. Let's talk about that a little bit. Like many of the high holidays, there is a large pagan influence within it. There was a time when the Roman Emperor Caesar wanted to do a lot of conversions of the largely pagan groups that were out there. Of course, what he really wanted was their land, but it's also, use a little bit of honey instead of vinegar to bring people in. So there were confluences, similarities between some of the things of Christian Easter and some of the things that were under Ostara. And basically the name Easter comes from, it's derived from the Germanic goddess Ostara, known as the goddess of spring and dawn. Some also believe that Ostara is connected to the heathen goddess Freya. Freya is all about fertility. And because of those things, we have many rather incongruous things that are part of Easter. Symbols, a lot of symbols that are a little bit odd. You don't see colored eggs and bunnies very prominently in the Bible. Of course, these are pagan residue. These are things that have become symbols that are now basically kind of mainstays of Easter. But of course, they come from the pagan idea of fertility, the egg and the bunny. Of course, we all know why bunnies and eggs may be thought of about fertility. This is the time of the year when the earth really needs to be fertile. That's why fertility is so important. Why is that so important? Because if you want a great harvest in the fall, you want to have fertility now. You want everything to start really growing. So it's a very positive force that people feel around spring. Now, when you think of horror, you don't usually think of spring. Fall is the obvious time that we think of horror, when the nights are really long. It feels like we're close to Halloween. Harvest, the colors are brown and orange. Death feels as if it's approaching. Well, that's rather obvious, but really, spring has a horror that is hidden beneath the surface. Things look bright and warm when you're looking at springtime, but that's the surface. There's something sinister underneath all of those pastel colors and those flowers and those buzzing bees. There's a reason that Ostara and several old gods were remembered so much around this time of the year, and why sacrifices were made to them. Because a bad harvest can be the difference between life and death for an entire community. Desperation can lead to the need to have multiple types of sacrifices to the old gods. The old gods were directly connected to land. They were directly connected to nature. And so those sacrifices might start small. They might start with food. Then they might start going to animals. And maybe it went a little bit darker than that. The old gods we're connected to the earth and nature in a way that we are not. And with that, there are some great horror films that talk about that anxiety of the early man that is still with us, that still hangs in the symbolism of our religions and the symbolism of our popular culture. We have ideas about the old gods of springtime, and good horror finds its way to talk about some of that stuff, especially when it's stuff that a lot of times we don't really want to talk about. So, many of these movies that I'm going to talk about today, they don't show any old gods. The scary stuff, the things that these movies really master are the people who believe in the old gods, what they'll do to worship those old gods. That's the scary stuff. These movies are full of people who do horrible things, and they have no belief that what they are doing is horrible. In fact, they find what they're doing as holy. They find what they're doing as helpful. They find what they're doing as part of the community. These are traditions. After 2 generations, traditions or habits become traditions. And after a while, if everybody is doing what you are doing and it all seems all right and it's helpful to everybody, it doesn't matter what the dark past is. So the movies I'm going to talk about, at their heart, even though they are horrific, many times they are celebrations of new life. They are about regeneration. They are about resurrection. But they take it from the darker side. And these are movies and these are miniseries. But let's start, before we go to movies and miniseries, let's talk about a very famous short story that really mastered this art. And I think many of the movies that we're going to talk about owe a lot of debt to this story. The short story is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Now, it's a very famous story that I think ran in the New Yorker in 1948. Basically, it's a story about a village somewhere in New England. About 300 residents are there. And the story, the way that Shirley Jackson sets this up, is it is a slice of life story. This is small town America getting together for a celebration, a community celebration. And it looks like it could be any kind of festival, a harvest festival. And the time is somewhere in midsummer. We're around June 27th. Now, there's no true significance to that date outside of when it first was published in the New Yorker. I think Shirley Jackson brought it on the 26th. So to add a little bit of impact, they made it as if it was a real slice of life story by putting it on June 27th. Shirley thought that was a great idea, so she changed the date. I don't even know what the original date was. Now, the lottery that is in the story is not explained to us immediately, but what we do know is that it is a local tradition. It ensures a good harvest for the fall. A lot of small towns have nice little rituals that are like that. Now, everybody in town, including the children, are really excited during this story, and they're participating by gathering all sorts of things, including rocks. Now, we find out that it's not just this village that has this tradition. We're hearing the kind of things that you always hear. The old generation grumbling because they hear that other neighborhoods or other towns up north, basically, are maybe thinking about not keeping the tradition going, and they're tisking that. So we're getting an idea that there is this widespread idea about a lottery being done. This festival, this ritual is being done. Now, all the families gather in the middle of this village in the story, and everyone in the village draws a slip of paper from a black box. Now, we come to realize that this lottery is picking someone to be special for this day. Now, as we continue with the story, we find out that there is a black spot on one of these pieces of paper, these slips of paper, and whoever gets that black spot is going to be a human sacrifice. Now, in 1948, the New Yorker was flooded with letters demanding an explanation to what the story meant. Now, some of them were outraged over the crazy violence that ends the story, but for the most part, people just wanted to know what the hell this story was about. Shirley Jackson masterfully kept everything rather vague. She did not give answers to why things were happening. Basically, what she did was she showed a pagan sacrifice in a contemporary small-town American setting. This was not in the middle of England, people wearing robes. This was people dressed like you and me, or at least in the 1940s. The villagers aren't painted as pagan worshiping people. They're not worshiping pagan gods. We get an idea. This is very American. This is very, I wouldn't say Christian, but we don't get an idea that there's anything untoward what's going on. It's very wholesome for the time. There is no real supernatural in this story. In fact, nature is the supernatural here. The god that needs to be appeased is nature. So the lottery is an American story. But I will say that most of the movies and miniseries that I'm going to talk about today are British. And what I can say about that is it just seems that the British are a little bit more comfortable with their past, with the deep ancient history of their island. And so even though it can be a rather conservative place, you do have Church of England, you have the Anglicans, there is still an acceptance of the pagan past, the Picts that were there on the island of Britain. And case in point to show this is that two of the movies that I'm going to talk about, they're actually miniseries, they're long-form movies, were BBC miniseries that were children's shows. These were made for children's television. Now, I want to tell you about these, and I want you to think about these being on American television at any given time. I highly doubt that you would see it. So it's very interesting to me that in 1977, you had this really adventurous story called Children of the Stones, and that's where we're going to start. So Children of the Stones is a story of an astrophysicist and his son who travel to a small English village known as Milbury. The father has come to study megalithic stone circles. So if you know Stonehenge, basically megaliths, these standing stones. He's come to this really large circle of stones, and he's in an area of England where most of the stones that are around, and there are plenty of megalithic circles in this area, are thousands of years older than Stonehenge itself. When they get to Milbury, they find that the village is actually surrounded by one of these large standing stone circles. So it is in the center. Now, inside of this town, it's very friendly. In fact, maybe a little bit too friendly. People say things like happy day as opposed to good morning or good evening. There are some strange coincidences in the story that bring these people to Milbury. The father, of course, is taking a look at the magnetism that is inside of these megalithic stones. The son comes along, but he comes with a gift. And the gift is something that he found at a thrift store. It is an old painting. And the painting depicts a pagan celebration within a megalithic stone circle. Now that they are there at Milbury, they realize that this painting, it looks a lot like the circle that is around the village, except that there is this huge column of light coming from the center of the stone circle, and there are naked people that are dancing around it, having a pagan ceremony. Not only that, there is also the depiction of a huge, giant snake that goes from one end of the circle to the other end of the circle, and its head is coming like almost to the end of the painting. And there's an inscription on the edge of this snake that is in Latin. And what the Latin says is, "I deny the existence of that which exists." Now, this is a children's show, and they're having that kind of profound language in here. I don't know, did you pass your O-levels to have to listen to this? I have no clue. But this is a story full of weirdness that is going on inside of this town. It is very eerie. There are choirs that are singing on this weird off-tone sound that you would kind of associate with what you hear in 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's really very chilling. In this story, as I mentioned, I think the townsfolk are very friendly and in a way a little bit too friendly. Everyone is smiling all the time and they say happy day as opposed to hello. The son himself, the son of this astrophysicist, is brilliant himself, and he goes to school and he finds out that he is behind all of the other kids in this small village. The kids at this school are geniuses. They're working out advanced calculus problems just to warm up in the beginning of the day. During the day, 2 kids come up to him and they kind of nod into him, bump into him, and they go, "Hey, are you normal?" And one of the kids goes, "Of course he's normal. He just got here." And what we realize is that these kids have noticed that their friends are no longer the way that they used to be, that the townsfolk, many of the townsfolk, are not the way they used to be. There are changes that are happening. People are becoming happy, which doesn't seem like it's an issue, except that's the only emotion that they seem to have. Inside of this story, there are also people who are having premonitions. The young son is having premonitions and hallucinations. He's riding his bike and he swears that he sees his friend who is riding a bike in front of him get hit by a truck. There is no truck. The kid is just riding his bike, but he swears that he just saw a truck go by. Now, are these hallucinations or premonitions? Are they something else? Is he really seeing multiple events from different times happening simultaneously? The story involves magnetic fields and ley lines, those invisible lines of power that connect sacred places. There are unconsecrated churches on the grounds. There is a black hole being referenced in the story, and there is the remains of an ancient resident who is in the museum, known as the barber surgeon. His bones are there. He was crushed under a stone, and there's an entire story about him. There is a broken amulet next to him, and in that amulet is a snake design, but parts of that amulet are missing. We start to realize that there are strange phenomena that are happening. Are the standing stones disappearing and reappearing? Or is it a trick of the light? Is it more of a hallucination that is happening to the newcomers? How is all of this story connected to the constellation of Ursa Major? Is everyone in Millbury changing? Or is there change that is occurring to them part of a time-based ritual? Now, Children of the Stones brings all of that into a very fascinating and pretty frightening story, especially for children. This must have been phenomenal in 1977 to see. Now, Children of the Stones does suffer from some of the limitations of 1970s television, but this is a children's show that is much smarter and much more complex than most adult horror shows are. Children of the Stones says that nature is timeless because it controls time as much as it does those that time itself controls. In other words, not only are we slaves to nature, but so is time. It's a very interesting idea. So I said that there were 2 children's stories, 2 miniseries from BBC that make this list of springtime horror. And the second one is The Owl Service. That comes from 1969. Now, what is an owl service? Well, let's just get into the story first. Now, Children of the Stones asks the question, what if nature controlled time, right? The next one asks the question, what if the land itself controlled destiny? What if a powerful and horrible incident happened on the land? So say this did happen. What if the land itself controlled destiny? What if there was some horrible incident from the past that happened on the land and the land absorbed the energy of that powerful incident? What if the incident, a story, maybe a fairy tale that continues to be told, is like a perennial plant? It becomes part of the land. It lies dormant in the land. But when circumstances are right, that story recreates itself. The story is reborn again and again with new people playing the same characters from the past. The story of The Owl Service is about a step family that moves to the Welsh countryside, to the home of that was bequeathed to the teenage daughter by her deceased father. So we have her mother, a new stepfather, and a stepbrother that are coming to this new land in Wales. They are trying to bond, and as one might expect, there is still a lot of grief, there is still a lot of resentment, and there's still a lot of unfamiliarity between everybody. So there's a lot of tension and unhappy history that's based in this family. There's an energy that is not exactly pleasant to be around. This house also has groundskeepers that are living on it. It's a very nice house, to say the least. And so not only in this story do we have the anxiety and tension of a family in turmoil that is not comfortable with each other, and there's a lot of pain and wounds that are involved in what has happened to the family, but we also have another family that is living there that are kind of from a different class. There's something about the way that these British folk are treating the Welsh that are here that you get an idea that there's kind of a class prejudice. And when you meet the groundskeeper has a son and his wife. The wife is the maid. He works the land, and the son works inside of the house doing all sorts of odd jobs and chores. When you meet the groundskeeper, he's pretty simple, and he talks in Welsh. And I think it's very intentional that he is at times incomprehensible. You just don't understand what he's talking about. And the only people who can actually interpret things for him are his family, basically his son more than anything else. And he spends a lot of time talking about the land. He's very proud of this homestead that he's been groundskeeper to, and he is proud of the Welsh heritage. And what we find out is that it speaks a lot about the legend and lore of the land that they are on. This is special land in Wales. This is the talk of a very superstitious man. So, the way that the story starts is the daughter who has inherited this home is in her bedroom, and she hears scratching on the walls and scratching the ceiling. And the way that this is done, and it's very eerie, it reminded me a lot of The Exorcist, Ellen Burstyn, hearing what she thinks are rats in the attic. And this girl thinks the same thing. She thinks mice are in the attic. Now, the groundskeeper's son comes in, and she talks to him a little bit like, hey, we've got mice up here. So he thinks it's kind of funny. He grabs a broom and he bangs 3 times on the ceiling, and 3 scratches at the same rhythm happen. Creeps him out a little bit. He decides he's going to go into the attic and see what's going on there. When he goes in there, there's just a lot of dust and old boxes, but there's also this large stack of dishes. A full set of dishes, and that's a service. For those of us that don't know what an owl service is, the service is basically a entire set of dinnerware that all have the same pattern. That is usually kind of has the family seal on it or something like that. And this one has a floral design on them. Now, when they bring one of the plates downstairs, the daughter keeps looking at this floral design, which is rather abstract, and she realizes that there's an image hidden in the pattern that goes around the lip of these dishes. And as she looks at it, she realizes that it is the body of an owl. Basically, the head is at one spot, and stretched around is the rest of the body in small fragments. She makes a rubbing from this plate with paper, and she designs a paper owl out of it. It's this small effigy that she keeps on her side table by her bed. Now, when the housemaid hears that her son went up in the attic and pulled a plate down, she gets very angry, and she runs upstairs and confronts the daughter and says, listen, you shouldn't be grabbing things out of that attic. There's a lot of dangerous stuff up there. And she demands that this daughter give her this plate back. So the daughter had hid it underneath her pillow. Reluctantly, she picks up the pillow and hands the plate over, and as she's handing it over, they all realize that the plate is blank. It is just white. The pattern itself that was on there, glazed on there, is gone. The pattern has disappeared. And that's when things start getting weird. Now, the lore of the land, I talked about how the groundskeeper that is, talks about the land all the time, and that there is strong lore of Wales that is entrenched in the ground that they walk on. And the lore of the land here is that this is the spot where the goddess Blodeuwedd was created. Now, Blodeuwedd is better known as the May Queen. It was a woman made of flowers. It's also the land where there was an illicit affair among magical creatures that led to a conspiracy and a murder to the man who married this May Queen. And it is also the place, the land where magicians appeared and put curses on gods. And one of the gods that was cursed was the May Queen. It's a legend that the Welsh don't forget, and it seems neither does the land. Once the owl design disappears off the plates, the Step family starts to change. There's weird sexual tension between the daughter and the groundskeeper's son, but there is also weird sexual tension between stepbrother and stepsister. Pretty outre for something that was a child's story. Now, why is this happening all of a sudden? Are they unconsciously playing ancient roles? Is this possession? Is this a pagan passion play that feeds the land with sacrificial blood once this story plays itself out? What's the significance of this ancient stone that is on the land that has a hole that's bored through the center of it? If you look through that hole, you can see something. What is the significance of the grove of trees that you can see if you look through that hole in the stone? Why is there a fresco of a woman made of flowers hidden behind the wallpaper in the den? Why are there suddenly so many birds flocking to this property? Now, the Owl Service is a product of 1969, and it is definitely a very experimental acid trip of a television show, full of crazy symbolism and jump cuts and zoom cuts. It is really pretty head-turning even for this time. It has to be the most avant-garde children's show that was ever made, and it is really interesting and really entertaining and talks an awful lot about the idea of how we live on the land, but we are changed by the land that we live on. Children of the Stones and the Owl Service have some supernatural elements in them. Now, the next movie that I'm going to talk about is just as avant-garde as the Owl Service, but its monsters and its themes don't really go to the supernatural. These themes go back to Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. And the movie is The Wicker Man from 1973. It is easily one of the most unique horror films ever made, and easily one of the absolute best. Now, if you're new to The Wicker Man and you watch it on my recommendation, you may initially think that I am crazy for saying that this is one of the greatest horror films ever made, because it is a very idiosyncratic film, but it is deeply entrenched in the universe of which it creates. Because this movie is not only a horror film, it's also like a Ren Fair come to life. And it's also kind of a folk musical. There is a moment, though, with all of the strangeness that there is, and there is plenty of nudity, and there's plenty of comedy at certain points, you may think that this is going to not be a horror film, and then there comes this one moment when you realize that all of the things that you thought were goofy, all the things that you thought were extraneous in the story, are actually setups for one of the most amazingly scary endings in horror film history. This is a profoundly scary film. Now, the story of The Wicker Man revolves around a Scottish police officer who receives an anonymous letter from a nearby island that states that a little girl has gone missing on the island, and there is belief. The person who has written this letter believes that there was foul play. Now, the police sergeant believes that it's very, very possible that there's foul play because the crime happened on the island of Summer Isle, and it's a religious commune on a private island off the coast. The religion that is on Summer Isle is pagan. It is earth-based, and it is very hedonistic. Now, the sergeant, the Scottish police officer, his name is Sergeant Howie, and he is a strict, devout Christian who remains celibate through his life. He is not married, and he remains celibate. And this island that he's going to go to is anathema to him. It is a direct slap in the face to his strong beliefs. Summer Isle is a society without police or traditional government structure. This is a commune that keeps running through the exporting of very popular and very abundant fruit crops. There's no Christianity at all. There is only one religion on this island, and it is a pagan, earth-based religion. Churches that used to be there have been deconsecrated. People are openly having sex in the fields. Children are taught about the sexual symbolism of the maypole in classes. There are people who have sore throats, and the answer is swallowing a toad. This is stuff that just drives Sergeant Howie insane. Now, the ancient pagan gods are being celebrated openly in this place. Now, I mentioned that this was a musical in some ways. Now, what it makes it a musical is that there is a constant soundtrack of folk music. And we're not talking Bob Dylan folk music. We're talking folk music that are authentic pagan folk songs that basically have existed before words were even written down in sheet music. These are handed down century after century. And they are part of the storytelling that happens inside of this movie. Now, at first, when Sergeant Howie meets the townsfolk, they're rather standoffish. In fact, they're hilariously standoffish. He is an outsider, and the older folks that are there really have no time for him. And they give him a little bit of a fuck you when he first shows up by way of seaplane, and when he sees them as standoffish, the first thing that he thinks is that they are hiding evidence of the crime. And he continues to find very strange clues that make him feel that he might be getting close to an answer to what has happened to this small girl who has gone missing. But as time goes by, they may have started as standoffish, but they start to really welcome him. But they welcome him in a very playful way. They treat him as harmless. Here is this authority figure. They don't have police officers at all. Here is this guy that stands for the nation that they are still under somewhat. And they really could care less. They find him kind of an artifact of a society that means little to the islanders these days. They are all under the patriarchy of Lord Summerisle, a very refined fellow who is continuing the work of his grandfather, who basically started Summerisle. And he is very kind to Sergeant Howie, although I would say he's polite but a little bit condescending. They have some great conversations about religion, but you have an idea that Lord Summerisle doesn't feel that he's hiding anything. Nobody feels that they're hiding anything. They don't feel that there's any wrongdoing happening. He's very comfortable in front of Sergeant Howie, and he's basically just allowing this man's investigation to run its course. Now, the thing is, Sergeant Howie feels that people may be hiding a crime, and he's right, although it's not the crime he's thinking of. Everyone on the island is hiding something for sure. But it's a conspiracy, and it's not the conspiracy that he came there to talk about. It's not at all what he thinks it is. And by the time he realizes what's going on, it might be too late for him to stop what's about to happen. And even worse, he may find that he is at the center of the horror as it unfolds. Now, this movie may be creepier than any other one on the list. There are no supernatural elements. There is no horned god that appears. But the detail of the pagan rituals and the constant symbolism that is happening in the village and the overlying sense of dread that comes while people are smiling and laughing really gets to you. It makes you feel like there may not be a horn god on the screen, but it just might be that the horn god is watching the movie over your shoulder while you're watching. The horror in The Wicker Man comes from men. The horror in The Wicker Man comes from groups of true believers who do not consider that anything that they are doing is evil. In fact, they believe that everything that they are doing is holy. And that can be very, very frightening to watch. The Wicker Man reminds us that yes, springtime is all about new life. But it reminds us that new life comes into the world covered in blood. And there can be no rebirth without death. So, in horror movies around springtime and the old gods, there's a common link to these stories. There's a need for a sacrifice. There's a need for the lamb to be sacrificed, but it needs to also be lured to the altar. Sometimes, like the Father and the Son and Children of the Stones, the land itself lures the innocent people into a trap. Sometimes, like the Wicker Man, it's the participants in the ritual that lure the innocent person to the slaughter. But sometimes in these stories, it's not a lamb, an innocent lamb, that gets sacrificed. Sometimes it's a goat. Sometimes it's the lack of innocence that marks someone for ritual sacrifice. Sometimes it's the evil that men do that sets the ritual into motion in the first place. And the damnation and the rage and the violence of this goat makes this person run headlong into the ritual. And they never see it coming. And that brings me to Kill List from 2011. Now, what makes Kill List so terrifying is that you don't go to a remote island. You don't go to the country where there's megaliths. The horror here in Kill List happens in the middle of an industrial modern city. Dark forces in Kill List hide in plain sight. In a world full of banal rituals, there is a dark and devious one, camouflaged, working along with everything else. The dark forces here, once again, are not gods. These are men. And the story of Kill List is we follow the lives of Jay and Gal. These are two former soldiers who are now hitmen. These are men who have killed for a multitude of reasons, sometimes patriotic and sometimes far darker. Let's just say that these men have performed their own blood magic through their careers. Now, something went wrong during the last mission that they did. It's been about a year. And Jay has been emotionally broken from whatever happened on that last mission that went awry. These days, he stays at home with his wife and his young son, and the bills are starting to pile up. Well, one day, he and Gal are lured into an assignment to kill people for a large sum of money. They have a mysterious client. Now, this mysterious client is certainly anonymous. The only thing that we know about him is that he's well-dressed, well-educated, and that he knows about their previous work. And because of their previous work, he decided that they are the perfect people to do this new job. Now, what is this new job? They are given a kill list. They have 3 targets that they need to exterminate. Each of these targets have committed some evil that's not explained to them, and it is not explained to us either. The hitmen are told that they will get more information as they proceed through the completion of each job. So almost like a puzzle, every person that they kill, they will learn a little bit more about what's going on. They also need to continue through to the end of this kill list, kill all 3 people before they get to see 1 dime of the money. And they need to sign a contract. Sounds sensible enough, except that this contract is sealed when the client and Jay cut their hands and shake on it as a blood oath. Yeah, maybe things are about to start to get a little weird. Now, the 3 targets that they need to kill are only known as the priest, who looks like he's really a priest, the librarian, a man who stores a huge video database of unseen atrocities, and the last one is a member of parliament. But the code name of this last target is the Hunchback. As the hitmen, Jay and Gal, meet their targets, things get weirder and more unsettling. The priest, when they come to get him, he's the first one. He seems to expect them. When Jay is about to execute him, gun to head, the priest closes his eyes, sighs, and says, "Thank you." Now, we don't know if Jay, who is emotionally unstable, is losing touch with reality, or if the bizarre reaction actually happens in front of us. We don't know what this strange response to being murdered would be. Jay thinks that there's more to what is on the surface in the extermination of these 3 people, these 3 so-called monsters. He decides that he's going to try and find more clues about what's going on. So the next person that they go to, the next target that they grab, he decides he's going to interrogate them. So he has one of the targets sitting at the kitchen table, and he's breaking his knees with a hammer. Yet the target will say nothing. And then Gal, who's starting to really worry about his friend, leaves the room searching for clues. And that leaves Jay and the target alone in the room. And the target confides in Jay. He turns to him and he looks at him with a certain reverential awe. And he says, "It's an honor to meet you this way." And then the target nods over at Gal in the other room. And he goes, he doesn't know who you are, does he? What kind of crazy game have these killers gotten themselves into? What is the significance of the odd symbols that these guys keep finding scratched into walls and behind picture frames? Who is this client? And who else is involved? He says that he is the mouthpiece for a consortium of people. Who are they? And why do the killers feel that the longer that they do this, the further they go along in taking care of this assignment, the more they are in danger? Why do they feel that they are being hunted as well? Well, you're just going to have to watch Kill List to find out the answers to that. In other words, I just tempted you and lured you into the ceremony. Now, if those films and miniseries don't feed your need for springtime horror and those nasty old gods that come along with it, I'll recommend 2 other films to you. Now, both of these films give you actual gods. They're monster movies, in other words. The first one is Spring from 2014. Basically, it's about a young man whose life is falling apart and he flees to Italy to hide out. He falls in love with a mysterious and beautiful woman. She's got a very dark and very long past. This is a movie that creates its own lore around the connection between nature and the old gods, and the connection between sex and death that comes with springtime. And last but not least is a film that was made by an Oscar-winning director that took his name off of it. Now, if you look this movie up now, the movie is directed by Alan Smithee, but I saw it when it was still directed by Oscar winner William Friedkin. The Guardian from 1990. Even IMDb hides this one. You need to type into the search engine the date it was made as well as the name The Guardian for it to show in the movie search. If you put in just The Guardian, it'll show you a million other things, but it won't show you The Guardian. You have to put in 1990. There is a lot of weird shame about this movie. Now, let me tell you the story. The story is a married couple, hires a nanny for their newborn child. But what they don't know is that this nanny has got a special connection to ancient druids and evil trees. And that connection has to do with fresh babies. Now, I'm not going to tell you that this movie is a masterpiece, but I will say that even when the movie is ludicrous, William Friedkin knows how to give you a violent punch to the throat. And it was a personal film to Friedkin. This wasn't just him taking a day job. He not only directed it, he also co-wrote it. And what I will say is that even a train wreck by William Friedkin is still highly entertaining. And I think that if you're a die-hard horror fan, you do need to see it. So if you're grumbling that it's still half a year until the fall, when the nights get longer and Halloween is oh so close and it's on its way, now you know you don't have to wait all the time to Halloween, that in broad daylight, in the happy sunny days of springtime, there is a treasure of horror movies as well. Because underneath all those pastel colors and those flowers is the blood of animals soaking into the soil. For every mushroom, there's a corpse under there somewhere. Those big roses that you see, they feed those bone meal. Because before there's a resurrection, there needs to be death. Ah, yes, that's the sound of my tin cup. Well, seriously, though, I've had several people ask me about how they could financially support the show, so I do want to address that. I want to say that Hellbent for Horror is a listener-funded show. I don't sell advertising. I don't waste your listening time with ads. Now, with that said, the show does need your help to keep going the way that it has been going. If you like the show and you're getting value from the show, there are several ways that you can help us out. One of the most important ways is just tell other people about the show. Write reviews on iTunes, and you can support the show as well financially from several different methods. If you want to use a credit or debit card, you can contribute an amount per episode using Patreon. If you don't want to use Patreon, you can also contribute using PayPal. Now, both Patreon and PayPal will take a percentage of your payment, and I know that some people don't like to use PayPal or Patreon. So Hellbent for Horror is also listed on Zelle. Zelle is a digital transfer service that is an option to most U.S. bank accounts. So you can find me on Zelle by my email address, scott@hellbentforhorror.com, and just list a dollar value that you feel is fair. You can also make that a recurring payment by clicking on a button when you fill out that information. And finally, I haven't done this yet, but if you're not into the whole digital payment thing, or you aren't available to be able to use Zelle or anything like that, let me know. And I've been thinking about setting up a P.O. box that you can send checks or money orders to that address. And if there is a way you wish to support that I haven't listed here, just contact me and I'll get that service up and running for the podcast. All of these payment options are on my website, hellbentforhorror.com, so it's easy to support the podcast and keep it going. And I thank you so much for all of your interest in our show. Now, let's get out of that and let's go to the listener mailbag. Yes, our new mailbag, and I have them written down, so hopefully my eyesight will be good. First, we'll start with listener Karn the Tigers. That's Australian football cheer for the Richmond Tigers. Now, Karn tells me that he is from Melbourne. He says, I'm loving your show, and I've been listening for about 3 or 4 weeks, and I am up to episode 37. You have great insight and an interesting perspective. I should be up to date with the newest EPs in about 3 weeks. I'm loving it. I have a question for you. What metal are you into? I love death and black metal mostly, but I like most true metal. Love your show. Keep it up. And I don't know if you can see it, but he gave me devil horns. So I give devil horns back. Real deal. And I'll talk a little bit about heavy metal. As you probably know, if you've listened to the show, I am an old-time metalhead. And my favorite bands are from, say, the new wave of British heavy metal and the early stages of heavy metal. Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, yeah, but really Judas Priest. I'm bigger on Judas Priest. And I'm a fan of AC/DC. Some people don't consider them heavy metal. I have a pretty broad door for heavy metal as well. I like a lot of, since you mentioned true metal, it's a term that tells me that you may like a certain band. One of my great guilty pleasures, and I keep coming back to them, is Man-O-War. Yes, I like heathen horror heavy metal, and they are silly. There's no doubt about it. But I can tell you that I get such a rise out of the heavy metal of Man-O-War and bands that are like that. I also like Megadeth and I like Metallica. Those are the safe picks, though. So what I'm really going to say is Judas Priest, Man-O-War, and Black Sabbath. Those are the big three, and shoot me if you don't like it. All right. Let's go to our next listener. An email from Tazzy. My first kiss was a 1953 movie version of War of the Worlds. I couldn't grasp why aliens would want to destroy us to take our land if it meant destroying the land too. My father watched it with me. I was 5 at the time, and when I started to freak out, he rewound the tape to show me how you could just see the strings on the models of the alien machines. Even as a 40-year-old woman, I still sometimes look to see those strings when I rewatch that movie. Tazzy, thank you so much for giving me your first kiss. I know there are a few movies that the reason that I'm not scared of them is because I watched them enough and I watched enough behind-the-scenes stuff to know how some of the makeup effects were done. The Exorcist would be one that I would bring up. Knowing the magical work of Dick Smith made it a little bit easier. Knowing how they had her levitate made it a little bit easier. But I still love the movie. Now, here's an email from listener N64 Danny. I wanted you to know about my first kiss, Gremlins. It came out in 1983, the year I was born. Oh boy, I feel so old. We had it on VHS, and it got played year-round in my household, not just at Christmas. I love that he just assumes that everybody plays Gremlins at Christmas. Now, horror fans probably do. But he says, I loved it all. Gizmo, the wacky inventions, the old man's shop filled with oddities, and of course, the Gremlins themselves. A lot of work went into them, and it shows. Its effects are so good that Gremlins still holds up today. Of course, you know all of this. But that's not the kiss. It was right after Stripe jumps into the pool. As a child, I knew that one drop of water could do, so I knew things were going to get really bad for that sleepy little town. As Billy and Gizmo run for it, I could see the lights flashing and a glimpse of Gremlins in the shadows, and my heart would always race. Then quickly afterwards, we finally see what has come from it, a swarm of Gremlins, with Stripe in front, running down the street. To be fair, that effect was stop motion and it gets lambasted by today's scrutiny, but it was less than 10 seconds long. So why was I so scared? For one, I was 5 years old, but I didn't wince during the kitchen scene or afterwards. It was the swarm of it all. One ant crawling about is not scary. It's almost cute, but a swarm of them will creep almost anyone out. That's how it affected me. My little mind couldn't take it. To this day, I get recurring Gremlins nightmares. It didn't help that my parents capitalized on this and would make Gremlins noises and scratch on the bedroom door when I refused to fall asleep. I love your parents. What a fantastic parenting idea. And here's an email from my listener, Jules Lawrence. Hi from over the pond. I have another fan from England. I get quite a few from England. I love the fact that the Brits love me. In the spirit of you saying this was a dialogue, I thought I'd send over some feedback, which hopefully you'll find useful. As you know, if you're a long-time listener, this is a new format that I'm going to, including having this mailbag. I'm a big fan, and I have checked out the vast majority of your back catalog on my interminable drives to and from work. Guests. I want to talk to you about guests. As a Brit, I do feel one step removed from a fair proportion of your guests. Lloyd Kaufman was superb, as I'd mentioned before, but for example, Mr. Lobo I couldn't really relate to. 42nd Street Pete intrigued me, but mainly because I know New York pretty well. And I think that's a great thing for me to hear, Lawrence, because I will say that even though I try my best to remember that this is international whenever I'm doing one of these shows, and with Mr. Lobo, I described what a horror host was, it's still not always going to make the effect that I would hope it would be. And in fact, I think in Britain, there's only been 1 or 2 horror hosts in the history, and I highly doubt that any of them were anything but more than recent. I think there's one, Bunny Galore, I want to say is the name. And that was, I think Bunny started in the 2000s. So back in the heyday that we're talking about of horror hosts, back in the 70s into, say, the 90s and early 2000s, there was nothing like that in Britain. So it's great for me to remember that sometimes the Americana can be interesting to people and sometimes it can be just confusing. So thank you so much for letting me know that, Jules. And Jules also had one more thing to bring up. I like someone who doubles down. One last thing, and I suppose my original intention of this email, a couple of suggestions for episodes. Weimar Germany, German expressionist horror, Caligari and Nosferatu, obviously, but early Fritz Lang too. Maybe also Jacques Tourneur, Night of the Demon is a personal favorite of mine. I had the pleasure of taking my 11-year-old son to see it on the big screen a week or so ago, and it looks fantastic blown up to proper size. Maybe even horror in the atomic age. Okay, maybe we're moving into Wrong Reel territory, another great podcast, by the way, Wrong Reel. But when we talk about cinema history, but I reckon a lot of these older movies have plenty to offer us. And I cannot agree with you more, Jules. I have talked about Weimar Germany a little bit in episode 13, I believe, Picking at the Scabs. I did a pretty in-depth dive down into Caligari, but it would be interesting to talk about the entire pantheon of those movies. I have not yet talked about Nosferatu, and it's made by one of my favorite directors. Also, you brought up Fritz Lang. There's some really great movies that he did. You also mentioned Jacques Tourneur's Night of the Demon, which is, Night of the Demon, which is one of the great movies of that time period. I am thinking about doing a Val Lewton piece. Val Lewton was the producer of Night of the Demon, and he made Cat People and The Leopard Man and I Walk with a Zombie. All of these movies that were kind of like film noir meets horror. When people talk about horror movies now, and they want to call them post-horror, movies that are more psychological and don't have supernatural stuff, I like to say Val Lewton did that in the 40s. So there very well might be a show coming up very soon that has Val Lewton and Jacques involved in it. And those are the people, the mail that we had for this time period. Thanks so much for bringing in the mail. Folks, please do send me. You can send me comments to my Twitter page. I answer the direct mail. My email address. I will say that doing a book, which I am doing, takes a bit of my time, and I'm not as quick on personally answering the email, so I want to get those emails on the shows as well, so that you don't feel left behind and I can talk about them and do the show at the same time. I got to try and do a little bit of time management. You wouldn't believe how terrible I am at this point. Now we've come to the part of the show, which is the pick of the episode. As people probably realized last episode, we started up this idea of me rating a movie that I've seen recently. And I have a very, very stringent and very important rating system. And I think you'll agree when you hear it at the end, once I talk about the movie. And the movie that I'm going to talk about this time, the pick of the episode, is Radius from 2017. Radius is a interesting premise, done rather well, with a few great surprises in it. But it's also a little bit ludicrous. So you may enjoy it and you may not. Here's the story, a little bit of the story. I'm not going to give a lot. There's a man named Liam. He wakes up. The movie starts with him waking up in a car crash. He is thrown from the vehicle. We see the vehicle overturned behind him. He has a big gash on his head. He has no memory of who he is. Now, he's making his way to town to look for help, and a car is coming down the road towards him, and he gets in front of it, and he starts waving the car down, and the car starts to turn towards him. He jumps out of the way, and the car rolls down the embankment and just stops. And when he goes over to the car and he opens up the door, the person behind the wheel is dead. As he walks towards town, he keeps finding dead bodies, all of them with their eyes strangely pale. His first assessment is, my God, I've got to get out of here. There is a virus present in the air. There is germ warfare. Something is happening in the air. So he covers his mouth and he tries to find his way into town to get help. He goes into a diner and everyone is dead. Soon, though, he discovers that it isn't a virus. There is something far more horrible that is going on. But you'll have to watch the movie to find that out. What I liked about Radius is that it slowly builds its mystery. It's got a pretty cool premise. I like the mystery of the premise. We don't know why people are dying. And then when we do find out, there's more mystery after that. It is slowly unraveling some of its secrets, this movie, and I really like that. With that, I will say that the premise is rather interesting, but it can also be unintentionally funny, as the movie draws itself to logical conclusions over some of the ideas that are in the premise. Sometimes it turns out to be a little bit funny. There are times when it feels almost like a Looney Tunes chase that's happening in the middle of the film. But those cool surprises are worth the time. And what I really like is where the story goes. By the end of the movie, it is not the movie that you thought it was in the beginning. And I always appreciate when someone takes the time to really twist things up and try to entertain you. To me, the thing that is unforgivable in a film, and especially in a horror film, is boring people. Making movies is an honor. Not so many people get to do it. Don't bore people. And the folks that did Radius realized that to be true. It's a very original idea. I like it. It wants to be something that you haven't seen before. So because of that, my rating system, I give Radius 14.5 reanimated severed noses. That's right, folks. This movie, Radius, gets 14.5 reanimated severed noses. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Hi, folks. Welcome to the first installment of a new segment of the show that I call 5 Horrible Minutes. Every episode, I'm going to have a listener who's contacted me and started a conversation about horror by way of email, by instant message. I want them to be a special guest on the show. I'll ask them 5 questions. We'll have 5 minutes to talk about horror and whatever they're doing that they feel is interesting or creative that they'd like to share with anybody else. I found that a lot of the people that listen to this show are really creative. They can also talk about anything that they're just really jazzed about. So I want to give everybody an opportunity, the listeners an opportunity to hear about great stuff that they might enjoy and have listeners talk about great stuff that they've been working on. So today, my guest on 5 Horrible Minutes is Jason Kaufman. And Jason is a contributor to Daily Grindhouse and Film Monthly, and he's a member of the Chicago Independent Film Critics Circle, co-director of the Chicago Cinema Society. He's an occasional recording artist as Anaphylaxis, proud owner of 35mm prints of Andy Milligan's Guru the Mad Monk. I mean, you have to be proud to be able to say that. And Solomon King's Two Moon Junction. That's pretty impressive right there. Now, he also is the author of the book The Unrepentant Cinephile. It's a collection of his movie reviews from multiple outlets that he's written for. And he also calls himself an attempted filmmaker. We're going to get back to that in a little bit. But first, Jason, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is, I know we're on the clock. 5 questions, 5 minutes. What was your first kiss?
I'm not sure what the first horror movie I saw in its entirety was, but the first thing that I remember seeing I don't know if you can hear my cat screaming in the background.
That's fine.
Uh,
It goes with
it's
the mood of
appropriate.
the picture, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's just a cat, folks. Anyway, the first thing I remember seeing that like kind of like creeped me out, but I wanted to see more of it was my local horror host, Sammy Terry, in Indianapolis when I was, I don't even know, probably like 4 years old or something. And I was up too late, and the news ended, and then Sammy Terry came on to introduce God knows what.
So,
And
so what is it about horror itself that drew you to it so strongly? I mean, it could have been comedy, could have been musicals, whatever, but horror is the thing that really struck you. What's it all about?
I think a lot of it has to do with um, just imagination and sort of in any kind of movie or TV show or anything is some kind of escape and art. You know, well, not I suppose not like everything is art exactly, but that's usually the intent. And I've always been, really drawn to like dreams and nightmares and like the subconscious. And I feel like horror does a better job than anything else of really getting in there, like and using that, uh, using the imagination for interesting ends.
Mm. When you hear the word horror, what movie comes to your mind when you hear that word?
Usually, just like off the top of my head, like Dawn of the Dead, the
Yeah.
original, is like instant. That's probably easily like top five favorites for me. I've watched it so many times. I've had it on VHS. I've had every conceivable format of it and watched it over and over again, and never gets old.
So I said that I was going to get back to this, Jason. You mentioned in your notes about yourself that you're an attempted filmmaker. And I think attempted might be a little lesson from what you are right now. But what are you creating now that you'd love to tell the listeners about and that you think that they'd love to hear about?
Well, I'm putting the finishing touches on my first feature called House Sitters. It's a super goofy horror comedy. Sort of the way we're sort of pitching it to people is it's like Broad City meets Ghoulies, which is not exactly that, but I mean, that sounds pretty good. That's like good, good copy. I made some shorts several years ago, and then we tried to make a movie, and we shot like 70% of it, and then it just collapsed, and a bunch of awful stuff happened. So House Sitters is me and some friends kind of trying to bounce back and get something done, and I'm pretty pleased with how it's turning out. We're having our world premiere at the Windy City Horrorama at the end of April here in Chicago, so that's pretty exciting.
That's fantastic. Can you give a quick elevator pitch, or are you happy with just saying it was Broad City meets Ghoulies?
I think that's about all you need to know, really. Like, there's
Okay.
not a lot of story. It's like a pair of house sitters get a really sweet job, but it's not what it appears to be.
So what do you hope happens with House Sitters, and what do you want it to do next once that happens?
Well, I mean, once it's complete, the easy part is over, basically. Like, then you've got to get people to like watch it, which is very difficult. So I hope that some people will watch it. We're going to be, I've submitted to a bunch of festivals this year, and we'll see if we play out anywhere else. If not, we'll probably go to VOD later this year. Um, After that, I really don't know. I mean, I would love to go back to the project that we started back in 2013 with, the new things that we've learned and the equipment that we've got now, and try it again someday. But I don't know if that's going to happen right away. And then I've got a lot of writing projects that I'm working on too. So hopefully something will come of one of those.
So most people, when they're asked questions about movies, their guilty pleasure is a horror film. But since we're horror maniacs, I wanted to ask what your non-horror guilty pleasure is. What's the one movie that you're almost ashamed to say you love?
Well, I generally don't subscribe to the concept of the guilty pleasure, but I do have to admit that I am frequently embarrassed when I talk about how much I like basketball, starring Trey Parker and Matt Stone.
Yeah.
It's the dumbest movie, and I've seen it like a dozen times, probably. I don't know why. I still think it's hilarious. Sorry.
That's awesome. I love that movie. Jason, thanks so much for being on. Can you tell people where they can get in touch with you or see some of your work, especially once your film's finished? You may have some folks that'll be interested in seeing it.
It's housesittersmovie.com. We'll point to the House Sitters Facebook page. And from there, you can find our trailer and news on upcoming screenings and everything. And if you go to Vimeo to watch my trailer, that also will lead you to my other shorts. Pretty much all of the stuff that I've done is online somewhere. Like, it's on my Vimeo channel. So if you'd like to check that out, that's there. Also, I just released a new album kind of thing, and that's anaphylaxis.bandcamp.com. That's pretty much everything I've ever recorded is just there. Most of it's free. Yeah, that's about it, I guess.
All right. Well, Jason Kaufman, thank you so much for coming on 5 Horrible Minutes, and I hope you continue to enjoy the show and stay hell-bent. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And in the wings is a Hellbent for Horror book entitled Screaming for Pleasure. I'm currently writing it, and we're shooting for a release in the fall of 2018, so spread the word and keep your eye out. More info on that later.